Okay, we're ready to start. At the end of the hour, if you haven't picked up your a copy of the graded answer sheet, please do that. It's just a way of, so you can confirm what I calculated is correct. Okay, now we're starting, guys. Okay. Anybody have any questions? Anything burning? Okay, so we have Grace here, who is laser pointer crazy. I couldn't remember that. Just something else. Sorry. Okay. Oh man, maybe I should. Grace. Sorry, she can't hear me too. I remember she's deaf. Grace, over here. You. Okay. So before we start our student presentations, we got a number of those today. I wanted to tell you about this book I ran into last night, or actually it was yesterday, and I took some. You know how on Amazon you can preview a book, some chapters or some pages at least. And it was interesting. It was talking about how the environment affects the immune system. So I'm going to introduce that topic here once I get going, and then we'll have 3 or 4 or 5 student presentations. I think there's one person I didn't hear back from, and that's not. I mean, I just sent these out yesterday, so I feel a little bad at the shortness, but everything's kind of short. But anyways, it's a $200 book. And if I would have required that book, that's $15,000 that you would have spent totally. If everybody would have bought a book. 75 students times $200 is $15,000. And I'm thinking, even next spring when I teach this course, I won't require this book. But did I order a copy this morning? Yeah, because I can get it and read it and then give you some good stuff. There's, obviously I wish it was called Environmental Physiology of Domestic Animals, because I'm sure they're not going to talk anything about dogs and cats and dog pheromones like we have. But I just thought I hadn't run into it before. But again, like I've said, I'm never going to require a textbook in any classes because the prices are ridiculous. Anyway, so without further ado, the next picture is a little screenshot out of this book, and I'm going to introduce this topic, and then we're going to have some people come up here. But anyway, I thought it was interesting that they have a section, maybe it's a chapter in this book, about how the environment affects immune function. Uh-oh, I think I've been spotted over here. Maybe not. And so you should know that there's a lot of parameters out there in the environment, and we've talked a lot about them, that can affect the immune system. And then it's kind of interesting how you can judge the immune system, right? I mean, that's something we hardly ever talk about. How do you quantify an immune system to see if it's working right? Does anybody know in any of your classes, did anybody say you can do this and then this indicates the immune system is working or not working? Anybody? Any quantification?
Like if your lymph nodes are swollen.
Okay, so that's kind of like a clinical thing, yeah. And when your lymph nodes swell, I always say the army is fighting. Because the one thing about the lymph nodes, it drains fields, it's called, in your body. And if you know your anatomy, you can point to a lymph node and say it drains this area of the body. And sometimes there's some really weird stuff. Because in the human, there's a lymph node like right here that drains the abdominal cavity. Who would have thought?
Can you do like a titer test to look for antibodies?
Okay, so that's the second one.
Okay.
Antibody titer would be another thing that's more accurate, because the swelling of the lymph nodes just says there's clonal multiplication of the white blood cells that are in the lymph node. It doesn't say you have an infection. It could be an infection when lymph nodes swell, but what's one other reasons why lymph nodes swell? This is great physiology here we're talking about.
Cancer?
Yeah, cancer, but that's kind of like, okay, infection / pathology. There's one reason that lymph nodes will swell, but it has nothing to do with cancer or an infection. It's kind of
Allergy.
tricky. Allergy would be, again, kind of like / pathology. There's something, let's say, wrong going on in a sense. But yeah, do you know when you get a vaccination, sometimes lymph nodes swell? And when you get a vaccination, never think that's antibodies, right? Because some people get mixed up. A vaccination is antigen, right? And so you're given, in a sense, a pathological organism when you get a vaccine, right? It could be dead or modified live, but lymph nodes can swell because when that antigen is drained from wherever it was injected, it goes to a lymph node, and then the white blood cells react to that. So anyway, it's a great topic. So next year, if you know somebody that's taking this class, in my reading list, I'm going to find a bunch of reading on how the environment affects the immune system. So today we're doing some of it, and we might do a little bit after, because after spring break, I'm sure I'll have the book, and I'll say maybe give you more out of it. Okay, so anyway, remember that. There's the environment, and they talk about, especially when they're doing livestock, space. How many square feet per animal? And people are going to talk about that, because what's most efficient for animal production might be not most efficient for disease resistance. Temperature, that's one of our topics coming up after spring break. Photoperiod, it's kind of interesting. We're talking about photoperiod and temperature as one of our last topics, 2 topics. And then, we've talked about toxins, and then social, that's like your cohorts, right? We've already kind of talked about that too. So I thought it was kind of interesting, and then I've got one more slide to introduce. Is she doing okay?
Tiny piece of popcorn.
What did she eat?
Tiny piece of popcorn.
Oh, popcorn? Okay, that's not going to hurt. Okay, so then, we're still on this topic here. This page, remember I just clipped this out of the book that was on my screen. Space, and they're talking about floor space, and usually when you raise livestock, there's going to be a set number of square feet per animal, right? And they've kind of, some of the requirements are kind of dictated to by like companies. Like I think McDonald's requires, when you have chickens, I think they require so many square feet per hen, or a maximum number of hens per cage, or they want free. What's the latest on McDonald's on the chicken thing? Do they want free range chickens to get their eggs, or do they want, anybody know? Because I haven't kept up with that. I know sometimes they dictate. Anyway, so this whole book, this page is about space. So anyway, let's see. I'm hesitating here because I haven't read this totally. Don't jump on the screen. Anyway, this talks about studies that when you overcrowd, there's a detrimental effect on live weight gain, but it didn't have any effects on the immune system. But here's one test you can do. You can inject things into an animal and then see what its antibody response is, like a titer we've talked about a little bit here. And here they've got some, think of it just as an antigen. Let's see what else. Okay, I think that's all I need to do on that. Anyway, okay, so now we're going to have Clay come up. Clay's next. Are you here, Clay? Yeah, there you are. Is this yours right here?
Yeah.
Start of yours? Okay, I think you have 2. Did you have 2?
Yeah, just 2.
Okay,
little text
is that, okay. So, yeah, do you want the pointer? I'll leave it right there. Okay, Clay, tell us about what you summarized.
So these are I have 2 little text paragraphs on the effect of floor space, mainly with pigs. There's one study with chickens in there, but the effect of floor space on immune response. And there was 4 different studies. First one was done by Carnegie, and they concluded after their study that the reduction of floor space in pigs, it was 0.14 versus 0.28 meters squared per piglet. They concluded that reduction of floor space reduced the average daily gain, but it did not reduce immune response. And then the next study was done by Turner, and they had a different conclusion. They actually concluded that the reduction of floor space increased aggression and because the increased aggression kind of led to a depressed immune response. And
You want me to go to the next one?
yeah, go ahead and go to the next one. Their immune response for returners was based on just to Newcastle disease, a virus from Newcastle disease, was not necessarily overarching though. And then a third one done by Sutherland was more of a study on the effect of, or the influence of immune response based on the effect of space during transport. And they kind of concluded that they did like 0.05 meters squared per pig on transport, and then did other studies with increased space, and they couldn't find influence on immune response during transport dependent on space. And then the last study was done by Daffwang, and this one was done on chickens actually, and this one showed that was based on the amount of density of the hens, so how many in a cage, and they actually, interesting enough, saw a decrease in weight of the bursa and the thymus when they increased the density of chickens, but even though that's like compared to the rest of the body, and even though they saw an increase in weight or a decrease in weight, they didn't see any difference in antibody response. So they are also kind of on the same page that it didn't affect immune response. And so, like, based on all these, they kind of made the conclusion that you can't, with the kind of differing conclusions that multiple studies had, that they don't really have a set. They can't really conclude whether or not space actually affects immune response.
So inconclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now you mentioned two tissues in the chicken that are very interesting: the bursa and the thymus. So mammals don't have the bursa, but Clay, do you know, or what's the equivalent tissue
I looked it up last
in
night.
mammals? Or what happens in the bursa in chickens? There's a certain cell that's programmed.
I looked it up last night. I'm spacing it right now.
Yeah, that's fine. Anybody know can help them? You know, in mammals, B cells are programmed in the bone marrow, and T cells are programmed in the thymus. Okay, for mammals. Chickens, the B cells are programmed in the bursa, and that's where the B comes from originally. The bursa in chickens, and then the thymus in chickens programs the T cells. Okay, but yeah, so it's inconclusive. And I thought it was interesting here. So antibody production is one way to see if the immune system is working, and then it looks like they looked at a ratio, neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. And I'm not all familiar with that, but I think what's kind of interesting is probably to get a list of how do you quantify what the immune system's doing. And the other thing is that you mentioned, which was very interesting, is transportation stress. I think in livestock especially, whenever you transport them, think of that as a form of stress. Does anybody know, thinking of transportation / stress and prepubertal guilt, and does that ring a bell with anybody? Can you anybody have anything in their classes where there's kind of a relationship or something was done with transportation stress versus prepubertal guilt? Years ago, if you had a bunch of gilts that hadn't reached puberty, you would put them in a truck and drive them around. And you could look that up if you're a swine person. Because transportation stress, for a number of them, would induce puberty for some reason, that mild stress, driving them around. And you can look up the studies, but transportation stress off sometimes. This was years ago. I think it was probably before they got that Bohr effect quantified. Now you bring the Bohr. But years ago, if you had some gilts that were, the body weight was enough to be pubertal, but they weren't, you do a little transportation stress, and that induced puberty in some of the weirdest things, right? Okay, thank you, Clay. Excellent. Okay, then Alexandra. Is that yours right there?
Yes.
And that's, did you send me a PowerPoint or not? I can't remember.
No, I just was going to use this.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Somebody did. That must
Okay.
be somebody else. If you need a laser pointer.
Okay. This article kind of talked about the effects of like temperature and global warming and how it affects the immune system. Especially, they talked specifically a lot about Holstein dairy cows. So ongoing global warming calls for attempts to identify some measures for animals, to especially food-producing ones, to help them stay efficient under these types of constraints that we see increasing today. Studies show exposure to high ambient temperatures was associated with the enhancement of the immune response. And then there was like a couple of different people that did some different studies, and they saw that there was an increase in proliferation of mitogen-stimulated lymphocytes of Holstein dairy cows. And according to Lactera service, severe heat stress was associated with enhancement of hormonal immune response. And then another study was done by Nardone, who indicated that conditions of severe heat stress specifically reduced the concentration of cholesterol, IgA, and IgG in Holstein cows. And then Lactera also carried out a study in 2005 in dairy cows and suggested that the increase of plasma cortisol and or body hyperthermia may have been responsible for a shift from the T helper 1 to the T helper 2 cell.
Okay, now you mentioned an interesting word, mitogen, didn't you?
Yeah.
Can you define what a mitogen is?
Gosh. I don't know.
Anybody? From anybody's classes? One time, okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
One time I was on sabbatical at the IU Med School in immunology. And in the morning, I would take my own blood samples at home before I left, because then I separated out my white blood cells. And at the IU Med School, I would use a mitogen to make my white blood cells multiply. So here's what a mitogen does. It stimulates mitosis. It's a general term. And that's another thing to quantify. See how we're kind of talking about how do you quantify immune responses? So you can, in vitro, right, in a test tube, take white blood cells from, in my case it was myself, but we could do Grace or a cow or whatever, and then you can give it a mitogen, and then you can quantify the response. Do the cells divide and how many divide and stuff like that. So mitogen is a good general term. And my mind wants to say there's a mitogen, and I can't remember which one I used, but you might want to write this down and then see if I'm right. Pokeweed mitogen. Anybody ever heard of that? That's 2 words. You might think I'm kidding, but no, it's pokeweed mitogen. I think it's, the pokeweed is 2 words, but I'm not sure. Strange. So how do you quantify immune system? You could do antibodies, total, but then sometimes you can do how many types of antibodies are there, by the way? Get back to our physiology. 5. Yeah, there's 5 classes. There's some that are kind of controversial, especially the D, IgD. Sometimes species don't have it. But anyway, you can quantify how many antibodies are made. You can do a ratio, like the previous presentation had. You could separate out cells and give them mitogen to see how much they multiply. Okay, so then Michaela is our next speaker. Michaela, yeah, there you are, back there. Did you send me a PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, is this the, you want your PowerPoint up then, right?
Oh, sure.
But this is your thing, isn't it? Did you do this? Yeah, you did, metabolic. Okay, let me find her PowerPoint. It's got 1 slide on it, I remember that. Okay, let's see, here it is. And where did you find this, by the way?
I just searched like the negative energy balance.
Okay.
And it had a bunch of charts like that.
Yeah, that's a nice diagram. And so it brings up a neat point about negative energy balance. And let me see if I can, okay. Let me 1 second here check how that's working. That's not good. Here's a pointer if you need, okay? Okay, take it away.
So my part of the article talked about early lactating dairy cows and late pregnant sheep and goats, and how their energy intake is often lower than the energy required for maintenance, milk production, and pregnancy. And this is known as the negative energy balance, and it can be seen in the mobilization of body reserves, and they called this lipomobilization. And then other studies talked about how dairy cows, sheep, and goats are likely to suffer from immunodepression around the time of parturition. And then this leads to the negative relationship between the concentration of the broken down fatty acids and the immune response. So as the fatty acids go up, then the immune system goes down. And then I thought the diagram did a good job of showing when the negative energy balance takes place.
Do you want to point to something on the graph?
Yeah, so the challenge period represents the negative energy balance, and then the intake is lower than what the requirement should be.
So you're saying, especially with the dairy cattle, their immune system is depressed a little bit because they're mobilizing all those fatty acids. Is that what you're
Yeah.
saying? The fatty acids. Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to use that pointer. I like this diagram because it brings up this point about negative energy balance, and I want to show you a little more detail on this graph. But a negative energy balance is defined as when any given day that the cow eats less energy than the energy she expended that day. It's called negative energy balance. A balance of 0 would be, let's say she eats 10 units of energy, 10 kilocalories, whatever you want to call it, and she uses 10 kilocalories. So like here, look at over here, this is like prepartum because calving is that black line. So energy intake is over energy usage, right? So that's like a positive energy balance. Right here, energy intake is a higher level, because think of its megacalories over here. But then, right before calving, perhaps, appetite is depressed, and the energy that's required is less than what she's eating. So in this yellow here, that's the negative energy balance. It's labeled energy shortage. Okay? But it's really kind of neat. So whenever this happens, from this point to this point, the cow loses weight. Because if you're in negative energy balance, you're losing weight. And why are you losing weight? You're mobilizing the body stores to use as energy. So there's a deficit. So let's say the cow needs 10 megacalories a day. She eats 8, so then 2 have to come off her body. Okay? She can't like run a deficit, right? She has to either, the diet plus the mobilized body has to equal what she did today. And what's interesting is, one time I had a study with dairy cows in this very period here, and we weighed them weekly. Okay? Now, if you're familiar with dairy cows, some of ours were like 1,500 pounds. And it's another story. But anyway, one day I weighed, a lot of our cows had names, but I'll just say 13, 14, that's her number. So she weighed X today. And then the next week I weighed her, and during this period, and let's say she weighed 1,500 pounds. In 1 week, she lost 100 pounds. I mean, she couldn't do that every week. She must have been in her peak here someplace. But I'll never forget, because I was weighing them, but then I would go back and put the data in the data book, and the difference was 100 pounds since last week. I go, oh my gosh, don't lose another 100 pounds, because you're going to dry up and blow away. But that's negative energy balance, when they're milking so much that they can't eat enough, and so it's got to come off their body. And if you ever look at a good dairy cow, and if you're not familiar with them, you might think they're not being fed right, because you can count every rib. And the paralumbar fossa is caved in. But no, that's just a good milking cow. Okay? So the take-home message is, when they're in this negative shortage, energy shortage, or negative energy balance, they're losing weight. But then they gain it back here. And supposedly they'll gain enough back so when they're close to calving again, they're back in normal body condition. Okay, Kaylee. Kaylee is way in the back. I saw her earlier. And Kaylee, are we doing what I
Toxic
sent?
substances.
What's that?
There should be toxic substances.
Yeah, okay, good. What I had sent you though, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let me go back here. Is this, I'll just do here and open with this, and we'll find it. There it is, right there. That's yours, right?
Yep.
Okay. Take it away.
Okay, so I had toxic substances, and we've already kind of alluded to this with aflatoxins, but this article or chunk was specifically about farm animals, and there was a recent study that showed several plants mycotoxins, some pesticides and metals, along with contaminants from industries, are origins for record cases of poisoning. And cattle are most frequently affected. I saw on the North Carolina State University study that swine and poultry weren't quite as affected with aflatoxins as cattle were. And the effects of the toxins depend on doses, exposure, and animal species, as well as the route of the exposure, so like ingested or like topical. These mycotoxins are a family of secondary metabolites of fungi that grow on a variety of feed consumed by animals. Their complex causes immunosuppression by depressing T and B lymphocyte activity and suppressing antibiotic production and impairing macrophage and neutrophil functions. And then the reason, there's aflatoxin B1 and fumonisin.
That's close enough.
Yeah, B1 are the most widely recognized because of their worldwide diffusion, and they mainly contaminate like cereal grains, kind of like we talked about corn before. And then the study that I read from North Carolina State University is that the consumptions of, like, animals can consume aflatoxin, but it can reduce growth rate and increase the amount of feed that's needed to gain. And it also gave some ranges of, like, if you had to feed aflatoxin, what they could be. And for, like, creep feeds and diets for gestating and lactating cows would be less than 20 parts per billion. And growing and finishing cows that weigh more than 400 pounds can be fed diets containing 100 parts per billion if needed.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. When you're out in the real world, especially when you're feeding cattle and you need tons and tons of stuff, and if you know there's some aflatoxin, you can get it analyzed and say, okay, I can feed this or dilute it out, and because I've got to feed it. I can't not feed the whole silage full, the whole silage, whatever. So, okay, thank you.
Yep.
And I just want to point out what she said earlier. See how when we talked about those toxins, none of the reading did mention anything about the immune system, if you remember right. Those articles, they talked about aflatoxin and whatever. So this is why I kind of like this book about that. But look at how they quantified the immune function. So, because that's probably what we should get out today is how do you monitor immune function of animals to say it's depressed or not. So like here we go, immunosuppression by depressing B or T lymphocyte activity. That's very ambiguous, but at least you can say, you can quantify something about B cells and T cells. Suppressing antibody production, we've said that, you can do titer. And then impairing the macrophage neutrophil effector functions. Now, why are those two listed together? Because those two, they're different white blood cells, but they have something in common. Let me make sure we get that. Macrophages do something, and also neutrophils. Anybody help me on that? Phagocytosis. Those are both phagocytic cells. And really the two most famous ones. And the difference is the macrophage, that means large eater, right? That's the best phagocytic cell you have in your body, the macrophage. Because they're long-lived and they renew their energy source. The neutrophil is a macrophage, is a phagocytic cell, but the problem with them, they're short-lived. And they're very phagocytic, but they die a lot. Anybody tell me how you can tell in an animal or yourself if you have a lot of neutrophils dying in one spot? Pus. Pus is basically neutrophils that have died and some necrotic tissue. Because they're the first ones to come to a wound. And what's kind of neat about it is there's a lot of them And you need a lot of them because they don't live very long, and that's what pus is. Pus. If you see an animal with pus, that's a sign that their immune system is working. Do you know there's animals that can't make pus? And therefore they have poor wound healing? Anybody know what that's called? You see, it's an immunology day today, obviously. What do you call it? And there's it's well known in cattle and dogs and people. There's a condition, a pathological condition, where those individuals that have this, you are being so wonderful. Let's see, maybe I can steal you for the rest of the day, but I have a dog coming this afternoon in another class. So. Anyway, what's it called? When an animal can't make pus. Because if an animal makes pus, that's a sign the immune system is good. Because those neutrophils aren't in tissue, are they? Where are neutrophils right now in everybody in this room? Where are they? I'll give you a hint. They're in the blood. They're floating around. But they can be recruited to an area. And what's it called when they aren't recruited to the area of a wound? Write these acronyms down. BLAD. Bovine Leukocyte Adhesion Deficiency. Very well known in especially dairy cattle. And it's genetic, by the way. And in dogs, it's CLAD, CLAD, canine leukocyte adhesion deficiency. And in humans, it's just called leukocyte adhesion deficiency. But look it up because it's kind of neat because those individuals have problems healing wounds because the neutrophils can't get out of the blood into tissue. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's see. I think that's probably it. Anybody else got an email from me? Because I had one person that was out on a horse show. Okay, so I think we're going to end there. There's nobody here that still has something because somebody's out on a horse show and they're not presenting, so I'm going to reassign them. Okay, so if you didn't get your copy of an answer sheet, come and pick those up. I'm going to give you next week off, so don't show up for class. And be good. Be careful. Don't do anything crazy. Katie, that goes especially for you. Don't do anything crazy over spring break.